Hello and welcome to this, the fifth and penultimate episode of our Technology for the Safe System webinar series. The series has been organised by RoadSafe to explore how connected technologies can contribute to each of the pillars of the safe system approach to road safety. My name is Nick Reed and I am the host for the series. I work in transport technology and road safety through my company Reed Mobility and as Chief Road Safety Advisor to National Highways. I'm also a trustee of RoadSafe, which itself is a charitable organisation that brings together government, industry and research organisations to foster collaboration on road safety topics. We're very grateful to Bosch for their support of this webinar series and to Agilysys for their technical and logistical expertise in arranging these sessions. In our previous webinars, we have looked at the contribution of technology to achieving safe road infrastructure, post-crash care, safe vehicles and safe speeds. In our fifth episode in the series, we are moving on to discuss the role of technology in multimodal transport and land use planning. And continuing the theme of hosting each webinar at a location relevant to the discussion, we are today being very kindly hosted by the Smart Mobility Living Lab, a facility operated by TRL, the UK's Transport Research Laboratory, and partners here in Woolwich, at the east of London. The Smart Mobility Living Lab is one of the testbeds that make up CAM Testbed UK, a combination of facilities across the country dedicated to the development of connected and automated mobility systems. I have more than a passing knowledge of the Living Lab, as in a former role at TRL I developed the idea for this facility. But TRL has taken the idea far beyond my original concept and is now a thriving community of organisations working together, all in the interests of the future of mobility. Joining me here and online are four fantastic panellists to discuss how connected technologies can contribute to the multimodal transport and land use planning pillar of the SAFE system. This is a new category that was added to the SAFE system by the World Health Organization as part of the second decade of action on road safety. And I think it's hugely significant for two reasons. Firstly, the importance and relative safety of other modes of transport. Journeys made by public transport tend to be lower risk than those made by private car. So shifting car journeys to public transport is beneficial for safety. Equally, there has been the growth of journeys made using micromobility options, which are good for reducing congestion and emissions, but perhaps less positive for safety. How should we manage the tension between these benefits? And secondly, this new pillar reflects that in some ways we get the transport system we plan for. And so the relative safety of that system can be baked in from the start of the design of the built environment. Thinking carefully about the flows of vehicles, flows of pedestrians, and how the new infrastructure mediates those will have a significant impact on the risks that are encountered by road users on its completion, something I'm sure we'll get into with the experts over the course of this session. But before we meet them, we've made a short film this morning to highlight some of the fascinating ways that the Smart Mobility Living Lab is working in this area.
So today we're located at the Smart Mobility Living Lab, or SMLL for short. We're located in Woolwich in East London. SMLL was launched in 2020 and is a real-world urban testbed designed to support the successful deployment of all forms of new transport solutions. So lots of new forms of mobility are coming to our streets to create effective, convenient and safe transport modes to be moving around goods and people. But they're all having to share a common road space, which actually initially wasn't designed for those sort of technologies. An area sometimes forgotten by technology developers and these solution developers is how these forms of technology are going to interact with one another and share the same space when they're operating. And that's why many think that now is a time for a change in how we design our urban spaces and how we accommodate for all these new forms of technology and transport services coming to our road network. Connectivity can also play a vital role in this to allow all these new forms of mobility to communicate with each other, to mean they have more safe interaction and more efficient interaction as well, to improve the whole transport efficiency as a whole. Standards and regulation as well need to play a key role in this to stay up to speed with technology development, to support that safe and effective and successful rollout of all these new transport solutions. SMLL is a wholly owned subsidiary of TRL, and TRL is part of the Transport Research Foundation. At SMLL, we've got a team of engineers who work alongside our cutting-edge facility to support clients through the journey that they're going on to be designing, developing, validating, and eventually deploying their new transport solutions. I want to pick out the words Living Lab in Smart Mobility Living Lab because at SMLL we find that's vital when you're testing and validating new transport solutions, that you're doing that in a representative environment that they're going to be operating in the real world, in deployment. Simulation can play a vital role in this as well. And here at SMLL we've got 24 kilometres of the London road networks, all built in a virtual environment to support that simulation process as well. Our independence from government and industry also allows us to support the policy making as well as the technology development, validation and testing without any bias between those two different areas. At SMLL we also run an innovation community. This community currently has 37 members and it brings together organisations from across all different sectors but actually all with some shared challenges. And they come together to collaborate and work together to overcome these challenges.
Smart Mobility Living Lab for that introduction. We now move into the discussion phase and welcome our expert panellists. And I should highlight as well that you have the opportunity to ask your questions by using the chat function in the meeting. And in the last 10 minutes or so, we'll be able to pick up on those questions and pose them directly to our panellists. So if we can start with Jonathan. Jonathan Passmore from the World Health Organization is hopefully joining us later. But in the room with me, we have George, Olga and Gav. So George, if we can ask you to introduce yourself, please.
Hi, yeah, good afternoon. So I'm George Beard, I'm Head of New Mobility at TRL. So as you heard earlier, that's the Transport Research Laboratory. We're an independent research organisation with a vision for creating clean, efficient transport that's safe, reliable and accessible for everyone. And so we try and realise that vision through a range of research, consultancy, software solutions, and as Ollie explained in the video, we also own and operate this facility where we're hosted today.
Brilliant, thank you George. Olga.
Hi, nice to meet everyone. Thank you for inviting. I'm Olga Priyanka. I'm a principal consultant at New Mobility team at Steer, which is one of the leading consultancies in the UK. I work in similar areas which George does, covering zero-emission vehicles, shared mobility, and emerging services such as mobility as a service, connected autonomous vehicles, and mobility hubs. Nice to be here.
Thank you all. Welcome. And Gav.
Yeah, thanks very much for letting us join. Gavin Japman from City Science. We're an organisation founded in 2015 to help cities and private companies decarbonise faster.
Brilliant, thank you. So, George, if I can start with you, how do you see technology shaping multimodal transport and land use planning, and how does the SML play into that environment?
Yeah, I think really it's having a huge impact. There's a range of technologies in various states of development which are either having a material impact on the demands for our spaces right now, or which are likely to have those kind of impacts in future. So, you know, for example, we've got new vehicle form factors emerging like e-scooters or like autonomous delivery robots or delivery drones and so on that are they're new modes which are being added to the mix, and we're sort of yet to see how prolific these modes will be in future. But they're competing for space that's already limited, and new service models emerging as part of that as well. Like for example, with the drones and the robots adding to the last mile logistics game. And you know, other things we've got like connected infrastructure, which is enabling collection and use of real-time data, which has potential benefits to improve safety or reduce emissions, smooth traffic flows, and so on. So an example there would be one of TRL's software products, our urban traffic control system, which basically coordinates the traffic signals to try and minimise the amount of time that road users stop, and thereby smooth the traffic flows, reduce that congestion, improve emission and so on. And I think, ultimately, whatever technology or system we're talking about, clearly it's fundamental that it's properly tested. And so, as you heard in the video, that's what SMLL is about at its core. Holly picked up on the Living Lab part of our name, and that is really crucial because we've integrated a range of those monitoring technologies into the living, breathing, dense urban city environment. That enables kind of real-world testing of various products, services, technologies, whatever it is, in the end-user environment that they're intended for. And then you can gather those data and refine, tweak the system and so on before wider scale-up.
Yeah, and one of the things I like about the Living Lab is the community of organisations that participate. So, yeah, car manufacturers and local authorities and transport authorities really kind of add to the expertise and the knowledge that can be applied in developing those solutions.
Yeah, that's right. It's a growing community, really eclectic range of different types of organisations, and I think that's reflective of the need for collaboration across the industry. It's a complex set of challenges that we're facing. There's no one technology solution, there's no one company that's going to be able to fix it on its own. So let's try and work together to address those challenges.
Yeah, and Olga, I mean, one of the areas where collaboration is really important is in mobility hubs. I know this is an area that Steer have done a lot of work on. Maybe you can tell us a bit about those and how technology contributes to making a mobility hub work.
Yeah, absolutely. So mobility hub could be defined as a recognizable and easily identifiable space which brings together both shared and public transport modes in addition with other facilities such as co-working spaces or cafes or electric vehicles infrastructure. So I think for me, the key difference between transport interchange and mobility hub is this addition of both shared and public transport modes which are brought together. So they're quite popular or more developed in Europe. I think in the States they're starting to look at the development of mobility hubs. In the UK there are lots of local authorities which are currently looking at developing mobility hubs. Lots of them are at different stages. Some of them being implemented, like for example in London Borough of Redbridge. I think they provide the opportunity to kind of to provide extra information and bring all different modes together, encouraging sustainable transport travel, and also improving the placemaking around the hub. I think different hubs require a tailor-made approach to its development, so there are different sizes and different types, which are suited for example, rural areas or urban areas or semi-urban areas. So I don't think there is like one fit-for-all approach in terms of when you develop and how you develop mobility hubs. In terms of safety, I think it's quite important that mobility hubs are safe by design. So you would need to think about what type of surfacing is used, how they're positioned, access to mobility hubs, and also like they should be well lit and CCTV cameras should be in operation. From the technological perspective, I think the technology can improve mobility hubs, but in essence, mobility hubs is just bringing all other modes together and provide as kind of hard infrastructure asset. So from technology, I think mobility as a service, which is a digital integration of different modes, can come along with the hubs. And if you develop the hubs, why not develop mobility as a service, bringing everything together? And also the hubs provide an opportunity to increase access to information about mobility as a service. Yes. So I think kind of hubs is a physical representation of mobility as a service, which is a digital integration of different transport modes.
That is a perfect segue to Gav, because talking about digital integration, if you're talking about land use planning, you're planning based on data. You want to know who wants to move where and why, and what goods need to move where and why. We need data to understand that, and that's what City Science brings to the table. So yeah, maybe you can tell us about how City Science collects data and how that's used.
Yeah, I think we almost go back a step actually to almost first principles. A lot of the work we do is about spatial representation of the landscape. So when we talk about mobility as a service, mobility hubs, it's about form and function. Where are you starting? Where are you going? What are you trying to achieve? So actually, straight away, is it residential? Is it industrial? How far? How close? What is the topography, topography of the terrain and everything else. So actually, we go right back to first principles and we look at a multitude of data sets, and that really becomes our evidence base to start our, right at the beginning, high-level principles about design.
And so from that data you collect, what do you think is the most useful? What things have you seen or been surprised by in powerful data sets?
I mean, it's an interesting question because ultimately I think there's, when we talk about data, and it's a different type of technology, you're talking about connected technology quite often there, or new mobility means technology. I'm talking about the technology of data and how you use that. But actually, fundamentally, not one data set answers the question.
Yeah.
We tend to look at open data sets, certainly at a national level, and then we tend to then build up local level data sets, particularly on the projects, but we have a system that we use which is effectively a spatial database which ingests all of that data, and then it's the conclusion of bringing that data together that creates meaningful output. So if you're talking about socioeconomics, deprivation, willingness to drive, willingness to cycle, all of those data sets together means that you can start to understand whether a successful implementation of a cycle lane or public transport is going to be required. So what is the connectivity you need? And then once you do that, then you can then start to bring in the safety aspects.
Yes. And Olga, you must be one of the organisations that uses the sorts of analysis that City Science provides, uses the data sets that are collected about movement and use that to think about safety. What things have you been, what data sets interest you?
Well, a range.
It's a long list, isn't it?
It is a long list, but I think it's, as been mentioned, it shouldn't be just transport data, it should be social and demographics data, which is being taken into account. And in our projects, for example, when we think about where mobility hubs should be located, we use a combination of different data sets, which we combine it as a matrix, and then we can see where there is potential demand for the hubs. But it's equally important to think where there's need for the services. So index of multiple deprivation could be quite useful to see what areas are most deprived and how whatever you do in those areas can improve.
Yeah.
So it's kind of, I think it's important to look at both demand and need, and there are different data sets which can be used to support both sides.
The most important thing with this, the most important thing with this is to build a robust evidence database, a data set to the cause. If you're putting a strategy or a policy in place that's giving that connectivity from one location to the next, with due respect, you might have a councillor that may wish to have a glory project between location A and B, but if there's no demand and there's no need for that, then it's taxpayers' money that's potentially at risk. So I think it's like professionals like ourselves who is using and bringing that data sets to a fore. Not only but using it, but also visualising it in a way that actually people can understand that actually that robustness is really there.
And where does safety fit into that discussion? Should it have more priority?
I mean, personally, I think safety is one of those words we, for many years we almost don't mention it because it's at the forefront of most people's minds. I mean, certainly if we've done a lot of work on sustainable transport, so we're talking about cycling and walking, and segregation is by far the safest means, but there's a cost implication to that. But I think when we're talking about planning, we're talking about trying to put the soft modes first. And public transport first, and that's very much the 15-minute livable city. Can can your local journeys, your day-to-day visits, be done without getting in the car? And if we're turning it around, car is almost the last thing we consider in the work we do. Especially that comes into decarbonisation as well. But then you need to make sure that actually it's fit for purpose, which is not as easy as it sounds because segregation requires land.
Yes, it's not just objectively safe, but perceived to be safe.
Yes.
As well.
Yeah.
George, that's a great point to bring you. I know you've done a lot of work on different modes of transport and their adoption. So I wondered, the big trend over the last 5 years has been the emergence of e-scooters, e-bikes, and so on, with potentially big impacts for sustainability. But what about the safety perspective of those?
Yeah, something we focused a lot on over the last 4 or so years. I mean, e-scooter safety specifically has got a lot of attention recently, a lot of negative press as well. It's an evolving space, and I think, speaking of data, there are still big gaps there in our understanding. It's getting better, but we still don't quite have good ways of really measuring safety properly in those cases. But yeah, I mean, and the other thing with e-scooters is we're in this weird, unusual situation in the UK where we've got trials of rental e-scooters which have been going since the summer of 2020. And we know that they will be continuing till at least March 2024, maybe longer. We don't know. But the private e-scooter market is still very limited because those vehicles are essentially treated as motor vehicles. So that means is to use one in a public space, it has to be type approved and registered, and you need insurance, and the rider has to have a license, you have to wear a motorcycle helmet, and so on. So that makes them illegal by default. So, I mean, that from a safety perspective is sending quite a confusing message for the general public who are not quite close to, as close to the industry as we clearly are, being embedded in it. You could visit any one of the towns that are trialling rental scooters and quite easily come to the view that, they must be legal, or maybe I'll buy one from Amazon for not very much money, and then use that device illegally without really understanding the reasons for that. And yeah, I mean, there's lots to unpack with safety. The Safe System's a useful guide here. Clearly, we need to think about vehicle safety, we need to think about users, we need to think about infrastructure. On the vehicle design side, again, it's kind of rental and private market, different things emerging here. On the rental side, there's some variability in vehicle design, but it's all kind of converging, and there's been lots of improvements over the last 5 years to make the scooters more robust, better braking, heavier, more durable wheels and so on. But the private market is hugely variable still, and from quite low speed, lightweight devices for not very much money, all the way up to sort of 5 kilowatt, 100 kilometers an hour, devices which are kind of pitched at off-road use, but that's just a branding thing. So yeah, as the kind of uninformed member of the public, you can buy one of these things and think it's okay to use. So we need regulations which will follow from this set of trials. We know that the government are going to, or trying to have this new LZEV category, low speed, zero emission vehicles, and then within that gives them the opportunity to create one for e-scooters and other things. That's what's needed to kind of mitigate some of these risks associated with just a kind of Wild West market on the private side, particularly. And on the behavioural side, there's lots to consider there as well. I mean, for the trials, a couple of particular issues have been around pavement riding, for example, and pavement parking. The trial rules state that you can't ride on the footways, you're supposed to use the roads and cycle lanes, but as a kind of an extra measure to prevent non-compliant behaviour, most operators have put in things like geofencing systems, which try and enable kind of automatic slowdown or stopping of the scooters if it goes on a footway. Now, that's useful, but the technologies are not foolproof. Sometimes they can think you're on a footway when you're on the road, or vice versa. I experienced that myself. Which kind of comes down to infrastructure. That we should ask ourselves why the geofencing is really needed. Like, why would a rider want to be on the footway? And it's probably because either they feel unsafe on the road, or maybe they want to take a more direct route than the road allows them to. So a better solution would be to have good infrastructure that enables those outcomes, improves actual and perceived safety, and gives priority to active travel and semi-active modes. And yeah, I guess that's sort of really what the core of this part of the Safe System is, around land use planning. It's kind of optimising the mix of these non-motorised and motorised modes, which is including a sort of increasingly complex set of vehicles. We don't yet know how to optimise it, but that's what we're striving for.
And the solution can be very different depending on the context, the environment into which you're trying to introduce that mode of transport. I was struck by what you were saying there, and it made me think of the examples where land is being repurposed for active travel, and that brought to mind the low traffic neighbourhoods. Gav, I wanted to ask this about you. One of the proposed changes around how we use our land for mobility is these low traffic neighbourhoods. Can you tell us about the effects of their introduction and what safety implications there might be?
Yeah, I mean, low traffic neighbourhoods are a relatively new concept in the UK, I think it's fair to say, and it's quite a radical change. And I think it was really brought round from COVID. Let's just go back to that one step. And actually, there was a very immediate prescribed need, which allowed authorities to tap into some funding quite urgently and radically put them in place. And now it's a continuation. So I think you have to recognise that before you go, are they good or bad? Because I think they were immediate need. But now what we need to do is we need to look at them from a longevity perspective. So were they designed adequately? Did they actually foresee what happens when you get to the end of the low traffic neighbourhood? Have they cut off rat runs, which potentially are needed or not needed? So there is, so the point being there is that we go back to data and we go back to land use. Yes. There might be some that have to have a slight rethink, or kind of almost like doing that first initial bit of planning first in retrofit to make sure that they have proper longevity and have considered all safety considerations. I think it's in early days in the same way as e-mobility for scooters is, in that I think we've not necessarily realised quite the impact of them. So there's a displacement effect. So you may have created some areas of segregation, if you like, for sustainable transport modes, which is going to be great. So therefore, initially, there's a kind of an assumption that that's a lot safer. But then there might be the fact that actually, but the roads around the low traffic neighbourhoods have got busier. In which case, the planning for low traffic neighbourhoods need to consider the roads outside as well, to ensure that those are upgraded to make sure that they're safe for everybody as well. Because with volume of traffic, volume of service vehicles, so HGV, LGVs, you potentially are increasing the likelihood for unrisky areas for the other modes. So it's a law of unintended consequences, isn't it, really? But we now need to ensure that we cover that from all perspective.
That takes us down a path of kind of induced demand and traffic evaporation.
Yes.
Do we understand that well enough? Do we know about how blocking a particular rat run, as you described, does that really displace traffic? Is that short-lived? Is it long-lived?
And I think that's the part where we're learning.
Yeah.
Because traffic patterns are, I think they've generally we've settled into a new phase, which are arguably like they used to be, but slightly different, and it depends on the day of the week, as the experts will tell us. I think we have to watch and plan and consider, really.
Yes.
Yeah.
I was going to say, I think they need to be considered as one tool in a suite of potential solutions, right? And we know, if we're just thinking about decarbonisation and climate change, we know that it's going to be essential to reduce car use, whatever way you look at it. Even if we electrify everything, we've got to reduce car use from our current state. So to do that, you're going to need basically carrots and sticks, right? So a low traffic neighbourhood, in a way, could be described as a stick because you're physically preventing cars from going into a particular area, but that probably needs to be used alongside maybe wider congestion charging, for example, like TfL or Oxford or whatever has implemented quite successfully, alongside incentives to shift people's behaviour, alongside awareness raising, bring the community with you. Low traffic neighbours is another thing that gets a lot of negative press because it's sort of quite easy to pull out the negatives, it's going to stop emergency vehicles, it's going to stop people who have to have door-stop access to their car. But there's ways around those issues, and you've just got to work with the communities to really convey the benefits.
And this goes back to having a fundamentally, resilient evidence base, which is arguably is data.
Exactly.
Why, where, who, and really, data isn't just the answer, by the way. The stakeholder piece, which actually, SMML is bringing together. You talk about collaboration, but that also facilitates stakeholder engagement as well. And I think that's important. I mean, that's our learning of experiences. We have fundamental data that we use as an evidence base, and then through taking and visualising that, we take our stakeholders on a journey, and then you get more successful buy-in. Yeah. And I think the LTNs were rushed in, and now we kind of almost have to do that. We have to put some extra pieces of the puzzle together to go, yes, but they were rushed in, but there's some data here, but there's also some other data that we can infill on that, and we collect some data as we go, which creates even more data. And then through good stakeholder engagement, you move forward as a journey. I like the carrot and stick approach, definitely.
And from my understanding, the residents affected by low traffic neighbourhoods are generally, the majority are positive about them. It's more bringing everyone on that same journey. Yeah. Speaking of bringing everyone on the journey, Olga, the planning process, I mean, it often gets criticised, it's too long-winded, or it's too convoluted to enable us to make the sorts of changes we need to improve our mobility. How do you think it supports or maybe holds us back from improving safe mobility?
Well, there's been lots of talks about local transport plans and what they need to have. So I think safety should be one of the key principles the local transport plans are developed. We mentioned stakeholder engagement, and it should be the industry, but also you should ask people who live in the area what they want, and you need to ask it before and after. So it's kind of, you implement something, monitor and evaluate, collect your data, come back to people. So it's different sets of data. But in terms of local transport planning, I think historically it's been quite car dominated, and the car was the king. So what's happening now, we're generally transitioning to more, let's focus on sustainable travel with a shift from private car to all other different modes. But again, how much money is available to be spent on active travel or sustainable travel infrastructure? So priority bus lanes help. Active travel, so basically we talked about segregated cycle lanes or generally cycling lanes. Then there is, I think, a bigger question of hierarchy of modes and how it's reflected in the planning process. So if it's not the car and if it's active travel, okay, that's all right. But even within active travel, George mentioned is different modes of micromobility. What about cargo bikes? Are they allowed in the same lanes with shared e-scooters, e-bikes, all together? So I think there's lots to be unpacked around different modes hierarchy and how it's reflected in the transport planning process. And if it could be done now, or at least, you have more emphasis at it, and funding is, the local authority will get the funding to implement these measures, things that would help to improve it altogether.
I totally agree, and we don't want to be I don't want to be a broken record about data. But it becomes even more important when you talk about safety and decarbonisation and sustainable transport. Because if you like, our whole tool set that we use from a BCR and return on investment is based on value of time. And arguably that goes back to a car ownership model. It works really well. We talk about traffic models and they're really focused on cars. But we don't have that. We don't have traffic models that have cyclist or walking or bus transport. They will never give you the same value. Your BCR won't stack up necessarily. Yes. So you have to be more resilient on data when you're putting forward the case that actually our strategic emphasis is on those softer modes, both for decarbonisation and for safety. They all have value. One thing we haven't mentioned today so far is the ageing population. Yes. And I think it's one that we need to be thinking about, especially when we talk about connected, because often overlooked. But that's even more important when we think about provision of service. So we did a piece of work in the Malvern Hills, a very rural area part of the country. 53% of the population that go to GP or NHS provision are elderly. I think it's something like 48% don't have access to a car. Therefore, it's basically car share or bus. The bus service is a case of you can get one an hour. So we did a piece of work, again, using data.
Yeah.
You know, what can you reach within an hour using a walk to bus stop and then bus, using existing bus timetables. So again, all freely open available data sets. And you can find gaps. So before you talk about a new bus service or a DRT service, you know, fundamentally the data tells you an awful lot of things. So it's empowering people with that data as well, I think is the important part, not just being the gatekeeper and the owner of the data and being able to manipulate it itself. If we make it easy for people to actually see that, that type of that access studies, then a lot more people can start to plan correctly.
Yes. Yeah, and I've seen some really good data from LA about low-income communities and how many jobs you can access if you have a car versus if you use public transport. And the answer is many, many more if you have a car. So there's a real question there about the equality. And I mean, that's a question I had for you, George, about inclusivity. You know, how does multimodal transport and planning help us support better inclusivity of our transport system?
I think it's a prerequisite, isn't it, that we have good quality multimodal transport, because, you know, cars are not suitable for everyone. Some people don't want to use them, some people can't use them. Certainly the case that not everyone should be using them going forward. So we need good choices. We need good choices that are suitable for everyone. Comes back to that optimal mix again. We need to work out what that optimal mix is for safety, but we also need to consider the inclusivity piece, which, you know, there's lots within that term. You know, it's a bit of a buzzword, but there's sort of lots to consider within that, whether that's the age piece, you know, making sure that all age groups can get where they need to, or different socioeconomic backgrounds, different geographies, people with young children, people with mobility impairments of various kinds. And they all have a different set of needs. So really the sort of best practice, I think, in inclusive design is making sure that we understand and consider that range of needs at the start, and bake it into the design, so as that we're not kind of putting stuff out there that we sort of don't realise there's a challenge. There's a good example here with EV charging, for example, where I think there was something like 20-ish thousand public charge points installed, but very few of them are accessible for people with mobility impairments. And so the charity Motability have done some really great research in this area, which has culminated in a new standard, BSI standard, that was published last week, I think, backed by OZEV, and is accompanied by some best practice guidance for how to design charge points with people with various mobility impairments in mind. So that's great news, but there's a lot of retrofitting to now do. You've got to go and, you know, correct the issue, which is going to be expensive. So let's use that as a lesson for other things. Let's make sure we think about the various use cases for new technologies and new mobility services from the outset, so that we don't have to kind of correct any errors in the future.
Yes. And you know, I think the Smart Mobility Living Lab is an environment in where you can start to develop those ideas and prove them out before widespread rollouts. That's really powerful. Olga, what would be your perspective on inclusivity and mobility hubs and multimodal transport?
Well, as I mentioned, with the mobility hubs, they should be inclusive, and it's about how you access the hubs, and it's including what modes are part of the hub. So if the car club services offered, well, how you can make car club service more accessible. There is options like some, for example, car clubs offering surrogate drivers, so it becomes more accessible to people who can't drive, so you can use a driver, but at least you know that the car club exists. In terms of a multimodal transport, I think in terms of mobility as a service, that's, I think, mass platform or app can be used to guide people with different physical impairments, for example, in a better way, saying this is an accessible bus which you come in at this bus stop at this time, this route has ramps, etc. So you can inbuild those features through the mobility service app and offer a kind of a more tailored journey plan and functionality to those people. I think there's also a kind of, there will be a difference between urban and rural situation.
Yes.
And in rural, as I mentioned previously, it's more about demand responsive transport, how it can be used to improve the connectivity, and can people use technology if they're older, for example? Or do they have access to this technology? Is the importance of, okay, yes, if you use a platform or app, we'll have an option for a call center, so make it more inclusive, I guess, and accessible for a wider range of people. And I think another point is, even if in terms of micromobility, if this micromobility mostly being introduced, how does it affect people with visual impairments or people using wheelchairs? Do they have, I know that some operators are developing the universal sound, which the vehicle can have, so it basically alerts everyone that the vehicle is approaching. If you're using RECs, some of them are being designed with advice on how, they can be accessed by walking canes, so people know that there is a REC, and use vivid colors to make the REC more visible, so which also helps. So it's kind of its use and actual placement of infrastructure, which doesn't make it more difficult for people with physical impairments to live on.
You said earlier, Nick, that the perceptions are just as important as the sort of reality. I think that applies here as well. It's safety in the broader context, thinking about not just kind of road safety, but personal security, personal safety. These issues are really important for inclusivity as well, because if people don't feel safe using a particular mode, or going to pick up a shared bike or getting on a bus because it's down dark streets or whatever it is, then that's going to be a big barrier.
Yeah, a good example is Vienna and what they've done in the 90s, because they they looked at master plan and including, like, the master plan has been done with inclusion of women, and they've been relocating the spaces and making sure that the bus stops are not positioned in the dark areas which are difficult to access, whether the steps are not too steep for people, and whether there's access to sidewalks. And I think that has happened in the 90s, and Vienna is considered a good example as a case study of how you can actually plan for more gender inclusive mobility and more gender inclusive cities.
We've talked a lot about data and perceptions. I wonder, is there a risk of pushback against it? So people might be aware of the development in Toronto, where a Google, an Alphabet company, was going to develop an area, introduce all the latest technologies, and the local residents resisted because they felt there would be too much kind of tracking or invasion of privacy. How do we get that balance right, George?
Yeah, I think privacy is clearly a critical consideration. I think some parts of society will be more concerned than others. Some people will be kind of more comfortable with technology in general and the use of their data. I mean, in terms of sort of coming to terms with it, as you say, accepting the risks, I think really the perceived benefits need to outweigh those risks in order for people to kind of get on board with it. I mean, in our kind of day-to-day digital lives, we're all making these judgments, whether consciously or not, all the time. Signing up for new apps, registering for websites, whatever it is. We're all agreeing various uses of our personal data in exchange for information or a service, whatever it is. And so I think that needs to be considered in the broader context as well. With Toronto, for example, I guess there's a concern of excessive surveillance of people where they may not have a mechanism for opting in or out of that, and therefore not really understanding what benefits they will get from the system. And again, I think that's compounded when kind of private companies, maybe like Google, who have so much power anyway, are the controllers of that data. Yes. Because then people might be asking whether they have, an individual's best interests at heart over their profits.
Commercial interest.
And so I think, the kind of setup there and the governance around that needs to be thought about as well.
Yeah. And Gav, from a data perspective, that kind of sensitivity over privacy and tracking and so on?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know too much about the Toronto and the conversation, but it does suggest to me that, you know, perhaps the stakeholder engagement at the beginning wasn't quite, you know, on par. You know, I don't want to say mini budget, but I kind of, you know, springs to mind. Yeah, there we go. Shouldn't say some things in front of the camera, but you know, I think warming up people to the idea, the benefits, as you said, George. You know, if you did that beforehand and then explained how you're going to do it, I think perhaps it would have been a different outcome. Yeah, I think that's the case. And you know, we've got to be careful on data. There is an awful lot of data out there.
Yes.
You know, yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I think you're right. The benefits, outlining those in a way that's accessible. It's not about statistics. It's about stories. Right?
No, definitely, and I think that's really important because data tells so many different stories, and it depends on how you visualize it, how you play it. And I think one of the things that I've, you know, my background is more probably operational rather than policy and strategy, and I'm now with City Science is a bit more policy and strategy, and actually, you know, what a a mayor view of data is something very different from a traffic manager's view of data. And I think that as if you like, custodians of, not custodians, but of people that are helping the technology forefront move forward in the digital society, we've got to be aware that actually, you know, form and function of data and visualization is really important to get successful messages across. Our experience there, and I'm pretty sure it's the same with yourself there, is that actually having early onboard dialogue and taking people through the story as you go through, rather than kind of, you know, putting it on the table at the end and then going, oh, that's not what I asked for. Yeah, that's really important. So you know, we engage people all the way throughout when we do particular studies, especially around opening up and visualizing the data.
I think when we talk about new technology, this is where it's even more important because people just don't understand how shared mobility works.
Right.
Or, for example, electric vehicles, you know, you still need to persuade people in terms of what are the benefits of electric vehicles and educate them. And it's kind of a big piece in terms of any innovation you need to do. You need to let people know why it's good and, well, that your data is not going to be used against you and or the data collected is anonymized.
Yeah.
And there's no personal data collected.
And unfortunately, because the world is a complicated place, we talk about cyclists and we just assume, you know, lycra-clad, fast walking, fast cycling on the cycle superhighway, and that may be one view of cyclists. But then there's a different view, which is the person who's literally just got on a Santander bike for the first time, and then there's the e-bike revolution. And we've talked about e-scooters. We haven't mentioned much about e-bike. Personally, it's an unsung hero because you can get further than you can on a normal bike within the same time. Therefore, your distance from where you start to where you end that's increased your range of activity. But also, you know, and I don't know the exact numbers, but I have been told recently that actually a lot of the people buying e-bikes are people that have never had a bike before. So not only are they're not a confident road user necessarily on a bike, but they've chosen that as a different means of transportation. And so they're perhaps less confident, or perhaps because it's electric, they feel that it's somewhere between a motorbike. Therefore, they automatically are confident, even though they're not experienced. So the problem is that as you have these different modes, you almost segregate even further. And I don't think we should necessarily segregate further, but we should just have that in mind as designers, as practitioners. That we're catering for a much broader range. You know, now we might be talking about a 45, 50-year-old, you know, middle-aged man on a bike that was never got on a bike before, rather than a 25-year-old, you know, graduate going to the first job on the bike. You know, so we've really got to think about things carefully.
Yeah, I completely agree with on the e-bikes point, and think the popularity is coming here, but we're definitely behind Europe on that front. And yeah, there's good evidence around usage of e-bikes in terms of people cycling further and so on. I think there's also great potential there in the logistics space. You know, as we've seen, there's lots of new vehicle form factors coming out there that are basically based on a EAPC, electrically assisted pedal cycle. I think there's a role for regulations though there, because with this future LZEV category, you know, there'd be options for for new types of e-cargo bike, essentially, or new types of other e-bike, which go beyond just the current sort of 25 kilometres an hour pedal-assisted 250 watt limits, which could have real application, I think, and still be managed in terms of safety.
And when you have an e-motorcycle that's, you know, substituting that 49cc for that 16-year-old, 17-year-old, you know, when does the difference go between an e-bike that's 15 miles an hour versus one that's 50 miles an hour?
Yeah, I mean, at the moment...
It's going to blend, isn't it?
It is. I mean, an e-bike could be in one of 4 parts of vehicle regulation at the moment, so it's quite complicated. We don't want to make it more complicated, but we need to think about how not to stifle innovation.
The time is rushing by, and we've got to get in some of the questions from the audience as well, so that we have had one. As we develop our road user hierarchy, are political leaders doing enough to explain and embed the change? Oh, yeah.
Not at the moment, I guess. I think the political agenda has been shifted to, recently. I think it was going on the right track before, and what I hope that, what we were hoping for, the new transport bill, which will be announced, will have lots of changes, but it's no longer the case, so we don't know what's going to happen with it. So I think it's just, what I personally hope, that transport still will be on agenda.
Yes.
Because everyone is worried about energy crisis at the moment. So it's kind of, you can't stop paying attention at transport. So I think there's more work which could be done.
Yeah, there's definitely some positives. We've got the changes to the highway code, which include that hierarchy, of course. I think that's definitely positive. You know, how widespread, how well known that is, not sure. Maybe more could be done to really help people understand that. We've got Active Travel England, a new agency under DFT, which sends a message in itself that there's specific focus on active travel, this new body that's just responsible for that, delivering the strategy that DFT set. I think, again, that's positive. But, yeah, it's all a bit chaotic right now, isn't it? And we're not sure where things can go.
And a question, again, from the audience, but it was one, sadly, Jonathan's not been able to join us for technical reasons, but it was one of the questions I was going to ask him, but the audience has asked it as well. What are the lessons that we can give to other countries, emerging countries, around multimodal transport, around land use and safety, that would be of real value? And what can we learn from other countries? Would anyone like to volunteer? Either something we can export or import?
Well, I think the thing we can import is segregation.
Right.
Segregation has a role. That's not so easy on a retrofit example, because land use in the UK is terrible. But in new developments and new standards, then I think segregation has to be, it has to be a part of it. I know it's not easy. It's money, isn't it? It's a 2-bedroom house and space and everything else. But there needs to be some imperative to put in segregation first, to really make a step change in that safety. I think that's only one part of it, though.
And Olga, Steer works internationally. What have you seen?
Yes, we do. It's different. For example, in the States, it's kind of a different approach. You have different states. You have it's not comparable, I'd say. But if we speak about Europe, I think, what happened lately is, for example, in shared micromobility space, is the fact that the companies, private companies, they started to work with the cities, and they implement the services in collaboration, rather than the private sector coming to the market and putting their vehicles on the streets. So there is a tendency of private sector working with public sector. I think it's a big learning, because as we remember, in 4 years' time, more bikes were everywhere, and it did go very well. So I think there has been that fundamental change, that there is public-private partnership in some sense. I think this has been happening everywhere, to be honest.
Yeah, that's great. George?
Yeah, I think in the UK and I guess lots of other countries, we're kind of battling against the car being dominant, and we're trying to kind of now change our system so that the car is much, much lower priority.
Yeah.
But there's lots of other countries, like in the global south and so on, where the car's not actually the dominant mode at the moment. I guess our lesson is don't necessarily follow all of the footsteps that other countries have taken in that respect, and maybe harness actually the great active travel rates or the use of two-wheelers that already exists there, and just make those existing modes safer rather than trying to.
And public transport has got to come back, if you like, which I think the bus back better is a good part, but we need to do more. The lessons from Germany and I think it was Spain that have done the low concessions on train fares for a month. They've seen a massive uptake from training that. That requires cash, but I think the benefits are quite obvious. So the sustainable focus needs to be sustainable, rather than just to dip in and dip out again.
I'll probably add about incentives, and as they've been quite popular in terms of e-bikes or electric vehicles in Europe, and I think there was less which has been done in the UK in that area. So but we also need to be very careful with incentives, because you don't want it to be done specifically for certain demographics. So it needs to be a complex approach.
One final question from me. We're doing each of the pillars of the SAFE system. How big of an impact relative to the other pillars do you think this one has? The multimodal transport, land use planning, both big topics in their own right. But that pillar, as a new pillar into the SAFE system, what do you think?
I think it's fundamental.
Yes. Last to the party, but the party now starts.
Yes, no, I think that's right. I think it sets the template for everything else that follows, right? And then hopefully it's all about improving that safety record.
It's probably last because it's the hardest.
Right.
But that doesn't mean to say that we should ignore it.
Yes.
So we have to embrace it and take it forward with as much energy and as muster as we can.
I think that might be the perfect place.
You ended it with musto.
That might be the perfect place to wind things up. But I want to say, firstly, thank you very much to George, to Olga, to Gav for their insights, their generosity with their time. Thank you very much to the Smart Mobility Living Lab for hosting us here today. It's been a fantastic event, and thank you for taking the time to make the video this morning. Again, I'd like to thank Bosch and Agilisys for their support in making sure this event could happen. And of course, I'd like to thank you for your time in participating and for your great questions that I was able to pose to the speakers today. The last in the series will be the next one. This is the final episode of the Connected Technology and the Safe System series, and that will be on safe road users. And I'm really excited about that one because in all of the pillars, in all of the webinars we've had, the role of the user has been absolutely critical. It's been an element that everyone has been keen to discuss. So actually having the time to focus on that in the next webinar will be really interesting. That will hopefully happen next month. And I really hope you'll be able to join us there. But for now, stay safe on the roads. Thank you very much for your time and take care. Goodbye.